Showing the context is everything when it comes to architectural design, but spending too much time on drawing or modeling the context can take the valuable time away from producing great design. So in today's video, I thought I'll share a sketch workflow that can help to show the building and its context in the best possible light whilst cutting down on the production time. So I made this imaginary urban grid in SketchUp in an iron grid formation. So each of these blocks is about 80 by 80 meters. Each of these units is about 20 meters, which leaves us with 40 by 40 core. In terms of height, I showed 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 floors, and they're at 4 meters each. The streets are about 16 meters wide, and that gives us a 2-lane car carriage here with a bike lane. I think in general, grids are a very efficient urban formation. They're very easy to lay out and navigate, but they do need some variety. I chose the axonometric projection because it's much easier to draw and it doesn't require to show the whole context. If I had this view in the perspective, then you would see a bit more of the context. So in this case, I'm trying to avoid that by having this axonometric projection. Okay, so now let's start drawing, and I'll just use the first pass to really establish the massing of these buildings. I'll start with my own building in this prominent location to the north. Before starting these sort of drawings, it's important to establish what we're trying to show. And what I'm trying to show in this case is just a rough proposal of my building and the context in which it's sitting. So at this point, I really just want to focus on giving some mass to this drawing without going into much detail about how exactly things are going to be constructed or made. Now, because I am roughly sketching these things out, it's kind of important to probably think through, what I'm designing as well. Let's just imagine that this is some kind of tech hub. And because it's a tech hub, it probably needs an architecture to express that. So I'll be using a kind of high-tech architectural approach, probably with some exposed structure and kind of intricate massing, perhaps with some solar panels at the top, and this kind of threshold space in the middle between the inside of the building and the square, which is public. And similarly, I probably want to add some definition to the buildings around. Let's say that this one immediately adjacent to the square is going to be some kind of civic building, like a town hall or perhaps a courtroom, and just give a bit of a definition to that as well. And what I'm doing at this point is just extruding volumes to then have a second pass with a bit more detail. I guess perhaps this second part will have a stair which kind of elevates whoever approaches the building higher up. This whole idea about maybe justice and civic liberties or that sort of thing. And again, I'm using the same idea to kind of step the building away from the street so that there is a threshold space between the building and the urban square. I might also add a building here. This might be a kind of office block development. Just adding some definition of the scale. When we talk about the scale in the urban context, the golden rule is kind of give a building the beginning, the middle, and the end. We can obviously kind of break that rule when it comes to certain typology, but roughly what it means, if I maybe take this block here, for example, which I think I might put some hotels and mixed-use residential here, and I start drawing this corner building, the beginning would be like a shop front or some kind of public access to the building on the bottom. Then the middle might be just the main part of the building, and in this case we'll put some hotel accommodation rooms with the windows. And then the end would be the top part of the building, which might be expressed slightly differently from the beginning and the middle. So what this does is really it kind of adds the articulation to the building, and it adds a sense of scale. And the scale is really kind of breaking down a volume into manageable and recognizable chunks. So you can see how this already starts to transform from non-discrete massing to a bit more defined situation. I'm just going to continue with the same idea of the scale around the building, around the block that is. And again, I'm not trying to go super into detail about what I'm doing, but kind of want enough information for the second pass. The thing is, in European towns, the older something is, the more kind of subdivided it is. And assuming that this is in Europe, a lot of these blocks have developed over time, so they'll have some variety of different buildings that were built over time, and therefore the size and the kind of the heights and the scale will be different, and the expression of the building will vary. Maybe add some greenery as well to the courtyards. Gonna finish up this office block that I started here, and maybe in this block we'll have like a central access into the courtyard through this point here to the side, perhaps for the parking or vehicle access. And notice as well, I'm using quite heavy line. It's just so that I don't get too involved in the detailing. It kind of limits of how much I'm able to show, because the whole point with this drawing, or part of this point, is to try and save up time that would be otherwise spent on modeling all these little bits in. The other thing that I guess is worth mentioning is that every drawing that you do, it does have to have some kind of purpose. And I guess in this case it would be just like a preliminary early stage design drawing that illustrates where the main building is sitting. So because that's the main point, it's really not that important if we're getting the surroundings super accurately. What matters really is just, do we have enough to show that the scale of our building and the kind of general expression and the design moves fit with the surrounding urban context. And so with this central block being the focal point of our whole composition, it does make sense to put some detail on the actual square. So this would be the kind of civic square and open space that all the buildings around are facing it. Because our building is directly kind of relates to it, it does also make sense to show all the other buildings that relate to the square in the same drawing. Because we're trying to bring some greenery and nature into this space, I might just choose this street to have like an alley of trees along the pavement. And it's important to show these trees because then we'll cover up some of the bits that we don't necessarily have to add details to later. And I guess little car park for the bus, or tourists stopping by, maybe more trees to provide some privacy for the people who are kind of hanging around in the square. And then this diagonal kind of breakpoint, which might actually continue along these two blocks here. So we might break the grid by introducing like a path through, kind of splicing through the whole block, and perhaps express this volume differently on top of this what's going to be like a triangular building. So we can put that in, again add some scale and kind of definition. This building, only the corner relates to the square. We're not going to add as much detail as we did to the buildings to the sort of north, east, west and south. And then these buildings further behind will have even less details. I like to have like a higher volumes usually at the corners of these blocks, because sometimes it makes sense to, when somebody is walking in a city, to have some kind of landmark like building, and usually it makes sense to put them at the corners because they're kind of the most visible in those corners. So as you walk, they're really there for navigation purposes as much as they are for putting more kind of square meterage into the block. And I'm just gonna add very little detail to these volumes at the very edges of our composition. And the same thing here, we want to kind of continue with the idea of diagonal building. In fact, maybe this one can curve so that you kind of enter and you go through the building. And I think Manhattan has this sort of break in the grid thing with one of the streets that go contrary to how other streets are going in a diagonal direction. The other advantage of drawing by hand is that it kind of lets you get away with things that you wouldn't normally on one of the 3D softwares, because this is way more forgiving. Like, we don't have to be super precious with the accurate scale, how many windows we need to show and how many copies of certain repetitive pattern we need to introduce in the drawing. We just kind of add detail as we wish. Line thickness helps as well in that it kind of limits how much I can physically squeeze into the page. Okay, so roughly at this point where we've drawn enough lines around the base, I'll just quickly turn it off and to see if I'm kind of generally happy with this composition. I think maybe it's slightly over what would be ideal, but I think it's looking pretty good. And now I can start the final bit where I reduce the opacity, maybe scale it down a bit, just so I can see where the guidelines are. I could stop with this composition just the way we have it now, because I think it's a great improvement from, you know, where we started at and where we ended up. So I guess I could add some color to it too. That I'm just gonna pick some kind of color that feels nice. Usually try to go for the washed out warm colors to give a flavor to the composition a bit more. And I guess we can kind of stop here because we now have this horizontal rhythm going on. It kind of defines the street that way towards our building, and then everything else peripheral kind of fades away. I'm actually going to reduce the opacity on all of these slightly, because I actually quite like the way all of this looks when it's kind of toned down a little bit. And yeah, and I could perhaps add some shadows as well. And similarly, I can probably do the highlights as well. Alright, and there you have it. So the trick is to really focus on the central bit of your drawing and focus less on the peripheral stuff. So you can use the same principles of sketching when you're designing either a single house in an urban setting, or perhaps you're developing a whole block. If you like this video, then you might also like this other video that I made on how to take a 3D model from a SketchUp and then use hand-drawn textures to add detail and to render the final drawing. So check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.